salt. Take a guess. Maybe you're picturing early humans sprinkling it over meat around a campfire, the way you might season a steak tonight. Or maybe you're picturing the opposite. Salt as some kind of modern invention, something farmers and factories added to food later. A flavor nobody actually needed until marketing convinced them to want it. Both of those guesses are wrong, and the real answer is much stranger, and much more revealing about your own body than you might expect. For most of human history, your ancestors barely touched salt at all, not because they didn't want it, because they didn't need to go looking for it. And then, at a specific and surprisingly late point, that completely flipped. Salt went from something your body quietly got for free to something entire communities organized their lives around finding, mining, boiling, and trading. To understand why, you first have to understand something strange about your own brain, something that has nothing to do with taste and everything to do with survival. Physiologist Derek Denon spent much of his career studying something called salt appetite, an instinct so deeply wired into the brain that it shows up across an enormous range of animal species. Not just humans. Denton's research demonstrated that when sodium levels in the body drop too low, something dangerous happens. Sodium isn't just a flavor. It's essential for nerve signals to fire correctly and for muscles, including your heart, to contract properly. Drop it far enough, and the consequences aren't subtle. They're fatal. So evolution built in a failsafe. When your body senses a real sodium deficit, a specific craving switches on, a genuine hunger, not for food in general, but for salt specifically. Denon's experiments showed this instinct operating in animals that had never tasted salt before in their lives, proving it wasn't learned behavior copied from a parent. It was already there, built into the wiring, older than culture, older than cooking, arguably older than language itself. Here's the part that changes the whole story. If that craving is ancient, why didn't early humans spend their days searching for salt deposits the way later civilizations clearly did? Because for hundreds of thousands of years, they didn't have to. Early hunter-gatherer diets were built heavily around meat and blood, and both of those are naturally loaded with sodium. When you eat an animal, you're not just eating protein. You're eating the sodium that animal's own body carefully maintained inside its blood and tissue. A diet built primarily around hunting and scavenging solved the sodium problem almost by accident, simply as a side effect of what was already on the menu. Isn't that strange to think about? An instinct sharp enough to be life or death, sitting dormant in your ancestors for enormous stretches of time, not because it disappeared, but because their food already satisfied it without them ever noticing. So what changed? Agriculture changed it. And this is where the story stops being abstract biology and turns into archaeology you can actually put your hands on. At a site called Zhongba, in the Sichuan Basin of China, archaeologist Rowan Flad spent years excavating something unusual: thick layers of broken pottery, specifically pottery shaped and used for one repeated purpose: boiling brine down into usable salt. Flad's research traced this activity back roughly 4,000 years, right around a period when local diets were shifting heavily toward grain-based agriculture. Think about what that shift actually meant for sodium. Grains, unlike meat and blood, are naturally low in sodium. As farming spread and diets leaned harder into crops instead of hunted animals, that free, built-in sodium supply your ancestors had been unknowingly relying on for hundreds of thousands of years quietly vanished from their plates. The ancient craving Denton studied didn't go away. It just stopped being satisfied automatically. And a craving that stops being satisfied automatically becomes a problem people organize their entire economies around solving. That's exactly what the pottery at Zhongba represents. Not a luxury, not a flavor preference, a direct, physical response to a nutritional gap that agriculture itself had created. And China wasn't unique. On the other side of the world, in what is now Austria, archaeologist Kirsten Cowerick has spent years excavating one of the most remarkable salt operations in ancient Europe: the Hallstatt salt mines. Unlike Zhongba's evaporation ponds, Hallstatt sits on top of a massive underground deposit of solid rock salt. And Cowerick's excavations reveal that Bronze Age miners weren't just scraping salt off the surface. They were descending deep underground, following veins of rock salt through hand-carved tunnels, using wooden tools so well preserved by the salt itself that archaeologists can still examine the exact grip marks left by hands thousands of years dead. This wasn't a side project. This was organized, specialized labor, involving planning, toolmaking, and enough coordinated effort that entire communities grew up around supporting it. People weren't just eating salt by this point. They were building infrastructure around extracting it, because the thing that used to come free with dinner now required serious, deliberate work to obtain. Let's put this together and reconstruct what that transition might have actually felt like from the inside. Picture an early farming community, a generation or two into relying mostly on grain instead of the mixed hunting and gathering diet their grandparents grew up on. At first, nobody understands exactly what's wrong. People just feel it, an unmistakable pull towards something specific, a craving that plain grain never satisfies no matter how much of it they eat. Someone remembers, or maybe stumbles onto, a spring where the water tastes different, faintly mineral, faintly sharp. They boil it down out of curiosity, or maybe out of desperation. And what's left behind in the pot when the water disappears is a residue that, when eaten, makes that persistent, nagging craving finally go quiet. That single discovery, repeated independently in different regions across the ancient world, is the seed of everything that follows. Evaporation ponds, underground mines, trade routes built specifically to move a substance most of us today can't buy for pocket change without a second thought. And once that trade existed, it reshaped more than just diets. Settlements grew up near salt springs and mine entrances specifically because access to salt became a form of real economic power, not unlike controlling a water source or a fertile stretch of farmland. Communities near Hallstatt didn't just mine salt for themselves. They controlled a resource other, more distant communities desperately needed. And that leverage shaped alliances, trade routes, and probably more than a few ancient conflicts that never made it into any surviving record. A craving hardwired into a single human brain, multiplied across an entire population that could no longer get it for free, was powerful enough to redraw the map of who held influence over whom. Here's the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with. Your ancestors didn't start eating salt because they discovered it tasted good and decided they liked it. The way you might discover you like a particular spice. They started deliberately seeking out salt because a switch in their brain, older than agriculture, older than settled civilization, older than almost anything you'd call human culture, had been quietly running in the background their entire existence. And their new diet had just stopped feeding it. The craving came first. The solution came later, built by hand, mind by mind, boiling pot by boiling pot, entirely in response to a biological alarm that never actually changed. What changed was the food supply around it. This still shapes your life today, in ways that are easy to miss because salt is so cheap and available now that the ancient urgency behind the craving has completely disappeared from view. That instinct didn't document it. The one that once meant the difference between a functioning nervous system and a dangerous deficiency hasn't gone anywhere. It's still sitting in your brain right now, exactly as sharp as it was for a Bronze Age miner descending into Hallstatt with a wooden pick. The only thing that's changed is the environment around it. Instead of a genuine scarcity that required real physical labor to solve, you're surrounded by a food supply that satisfies, and often massively overshoots, that same ancient signal with almost no effort at all. That's not a personal failing if you've ever craved something salty more than seems reasonable. That's an instinct thousands of generations older than the modern food environment it now finds itself operating inside, doing exactly what it evolved to do, in a world that no longer matches the conditions it was built for. So the next time you reach for something salty without quite knowing why, you're not responding to a marketing campaign or a modern habit. You're responding to the same ancient alarm that once sent Bronze Age miners underground and Neolithic farmers boiling spring water down to a mineral residue. An alarm built for a world of scarcity, now firing inside a world of abundance. If a craving that old, wired in before language, before farming, before anything you'd recognize as civilization, can still be steering your choices today without you noticing, what other instincts do you think you're still carrying around from a world that no longer exists?